Welcome, my name is Spencer, and this is part 3 of a series we're doing called How to Get Started in Spiritual Disciplines, or maybe restarted for some of us as we need to reimagine and restart, reignite some of these practices in our life. And as we've been walking through this, we talked about our expectations, we talked about maybe some of the distractions that get in the way of us practicing spiritual disciplines that are going to grow us. And in this session, we're going to explore what our target is. Because if you don't have the end in mind of what it is you're trying to accomplish and achieve when you practice spiritual disciplines, it's very easy to not actually go anywhere. You just end up kind of spinning your wheels doing religious activities without really accomplishing anything. And there's an old line from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Maybe you read that book. And that was one of the 7 habits, was that highly effective people start with the end in mind. And so we need to have this in place for us as we think about spiritual disciplines. What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to accomplish here? And so in this session, we're going to really drill down on this. What are we trying to achieve? What does growth look like as a disciple of Jesus? How do we define this? How do we think about this? And what are we aiming for here? Now, it turns out this is an old question. I mean, people have been asking this question for a long, long time. And so there are lots of people who have gone before us who have worked through different ways of thinking about this. How do we think about growth as a disciple of Jesus? Some people have looked at various places in the Bible to come up with this. I can think about there's certainly some people who might think about growth as a disciple of Jesus. Spiritual maturity means that you obey the commandments of the Bible. Certainly you're going to hear that in some churches. You'll go to churches that really emphasize behavior and emphasize the outward kind of things that we follow and do. And while there's certainly commandments in the Bible we need to listen to, these kinds of teachings often turn legalistic. And maybe you've come from a church like that really emphasize that growth as a disciple of Jesus is about our behavior. And so we begin to think about all the things that we do as disciples of Jesus. Other people have looked at other places in the Bible to also answer this question. Opposite kind of the commandment approach would be for people who look at the great commandments, which are when Jesus says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and then to love your neighbor as yourself, the 2 great commandments. And this emphasizes that I'm going to treat people well, but also I'm going to grow in a love of God that's deep within us. Some people have looked at this fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5 to define what it is that spiritual growth looks like, Christian growth looks like. So the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, and it's about these virtues that get developed deep in our character. And there's other places that people have looked in the Bible that you see this kind of show up in church history. People have looked in different places. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, he described the thing that we're aiming for here. He talked about 3 general rules of Christian life, where you do no harm, you do good, and you attend to the ordinances of God, or some people would say stay in love with God. And this is kind of what you're aiming for here. There's all kinds of things. And the truth is, throughout Christian history, we've talked about this in different ways. And as you look at the different ways that people have talked about this, it's all true. I mean, all of these aspects of growing in Christ, you could look at all of these kinds of things as being true, that yes, it is about obeying the commandments. Yes, it is about loving God. Yes, it is about developing these virtues. Yes, it is about doing no harm and doing good and these kinds of things. And so for me, as I've been thinking more about this over the last several years, I've come to land on a word that Jesus uses as a helpful target. And this is a target, but you could look at other places that, like I've just described, that people have looked through. But this, to me, is a helpful target to describe what it is we're aiming for and why spiritual disciplines therefore matter. And so it's a word that Jesus uses. You see it lots of places in the Bible. Let me give you an example of this. This is Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 and 25. Jesus says this: "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." Now, did you catch that word that Jesus said? Whoever wants to be my, what was the word? Disciple. Whoever wants to be my disciple. Now, somewhere along the way, that word disciple became synonymous with the word Christian. But really, those are 2 different words. They mean different things. A Christian is about what you think. It's largely about what do you believe? What do you espouse to? Like how do you live how do you think about the world? And it's largely about this element of belief. But being a disciple is about how you live. It's about the way that you actually go about your life. And so I've come to think about this word disciple as an incredibly helpful term to describe what we are aiming for. And as you think about what we're aiming for with spiritual disciplines, it's so absolutely important to have the end in mind of what it is that we're shooting for here. So in Jesus' day, a disciple was a learner. But don't think about learner like you might think about taking a class. It's not like about learning algebra or geometry or some sort of like literature. That's not what a disciple is. A disciple is about learning a way of life. It's like maybe more like an apprentice, or how you might think about a learner who's learning a trade. And so a disciple, like an apprentice, is learning to do what it is that their teacher does. Not just to know what their teacher knows, but to do what their teacher does. And so a disciple of Jesus is not just learning content, they're learning to live their life like Jesus lived his life. A disciple is learning to live as if Jesus were living my life, if he were me. That's really the question that disciples are starting to aim for, that we are aiming as disciples of Jesus. We are aiming to live our lives as if Jesus were living our lives. And so as we think about the things that we go through, we're asking ourselves and we're thinking about this, like, how would Jesus handle these situations? That's how I want to live. I want to live like my teacher lives. And it becomes a way of life, not just something that I know, something that I learn. And I find this so incredibly helpful because sometimes we talk about growth as Christians, we tend to talk about this as like spiritual growth. And so we think about growth as Christians in terms of like the spiritual categories of our life, like Bible reading and prayer and going to church and maybe serving the poor, something along those lines. But it's largely confined to like what we might consider the spiritual part of our life. But really a disciple of Jesus is trying to live their whole life as if Jesus were living our life through us. Like we're trying to live every aspect of us. And so discipleship and becoming a disciple of Jesus is a profoundly practical thing, not just maybe what we might call a spiritual thing. And I find that so helpful, especially those parts of my life, thinking about those parts of my life that I don't necessarily think of as being all that spiritual. For instance, I think about our work. You know, it's not necessarily a spiritual part of our lives for many of us. And yet, you know, as a question of being a disciple is, we're asking ourselves, well, you know, how would Jesus go about doing the job that you have, you know, if Jesus had that job? And that might be a strange thing to think about, but you know, Jesus actually had a job. He was a carpenter. And if he lived in a different time, in a different place, in a different family, he might have had a different job. He could have easily been an accountant, or could have worked at a grocery store, or been a plumber, or in a number of jobs that he could have had. And so as you think about the work that you have, a disciple of Jesus is asking themselves, okay, so if Jesus had my job, how would he do that job? Or if Jesus were in my family, you know, again, it might be strange to think about, but Jesus had a family. He had relatives. He spent holidays with them. I'm sure there was some dysfunction. I'm sure there was tension in his family, just like in yours. And so if Jesus were in my family, how would he interact with my family members? Or if Jesus lived in my neighborhood, how would he interact with my neighbors? Or if Jesus had my free time, how would he spend the leisure time I have? Or if Jesus had my money, how would he spend my money? We start to ask ourselves these questions of a deep level of how would Jesus live in this kind of way? We're starting to focus in now on what it is that we're aiming for. Because as we talk about spiritual growth, we're not just trying to talk about, we want to learn more about the Bible. We want to feel like we're better at prayer. We want to be able to sing all of the songs in church from memory. That's not what spiritual growth is about. Spiritual growth is about actually affecting the way that I live every single day so that I begin to live more like Jesus. And if spiritual disciplines aren't focused on that end, then it doesn't matter if you practice them or not, because you're just going to spin your wheels. You're not going to grow as a disciple of Jesus, and you're just going to become good at religious kinds of things, whereas what Jesus really wants for you is he wants your whole life to be lived as he would live, because he is your teacher. He is your master. He is your Lord. And so therefore, every aspect of our life is coming down to this. How do I live my life as if Jesus were living my life? And we need tools to grow into this kind of way. And those tools are spiritual disciplines.